An orphan black boy whispers 2 words to a cop, taking his breath away. The cop then freezes and instantly calls for backup, knowing something bad is about to happen. What were the 2 words the boy whispered, and why did they make the cop call for backup? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Daniel Carter, a little boy in his early teens, stood motionless on the cracked sidewalk, his worn sneakers planted between tufts of grass pushing through the concrete. The peeling paint of their small house seemed to blend with the gray sky above, where dark clouds threatened rain. Through the broken window, patched with clear tape in a crisscross pattern, he heard his grandmother's familiar cough echoing from inside. Graffiti decorated the walls of nearby buildings, splashes of bright colors that couldn't hide the neighborhood's struggles. A cold breeze rustled through Daniel's thin jacket, making him shiver as he listened to another bout of coughing. Inside, the musty living room felt heavy with worry. His grandmother, Mary, lay on their old couch, the springs creaking as she tried to sit up. The blanket covering her was thin and faded, much like her face, which had lost its healthy color months ago. She was all he had. He lost both his parents in a car accident years ago. "I'm fine, sweetheart," Mary said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just need to rest a bit." Daniel's eyes moved to their kitchen shelf, where 3 cans of soup sat lonely next to his grandmother's medicine bottle. The orange plastic container was lighter than it should be, and the rattle of pills inside was faint when he picked it up. "Let me make you some tea, Grandma," Daniel said, filling their dented kettle with tap water. While it heated, he checked the calendar hanging crooked on the wall. Red X's marked the days until their next check would arrive. Too many empty squares remained. A gentle knock at the door made both of them look up. Mrs. Jenkins, their next-door neighbor, stood there with a paper bag clutched in her weathered hands. "Thought you might like some bread," she said, her kind eyes crinkling at the corners. "The bakery was giving away yesterday's batch." "Thank you," Daniel said, accepting the bag. The bread was slightly hard, but still good. His grandmother smiled weakly at Mrs. Jenkins, who patted Daniel's shoulder before leaving. As evening approached, Daniel sat cross-legged on the floor near a stack of second-hand books he'd collected from various places, some from school, others from neighbors cleaning out their shelves. His fingers traced the worn spines as he searched for something new to learn, something that might help him understand his grandmother's illness better. The streetlights flickered to life outside their window, casting shadows across the living room walls. Daniel moved to sit by the window, watching as the yellow lights created pools of brightness on the dark street. His grandmother's soft breathing had evened out into sleep, but his mind was wide awake, turning over possibilities like pages in one of his books. "I'll find a way," he whispered to himself, his breath fogging the cool window glass. "I'll make things better for us, Grandma. I promise." Next morning, he blinked away sleep and carefully folded his blanket, moving with practiced quietness. His grandmother's labored breathing from the couch guided his movements as he tiptoed around their small home. Daniel went through his morning routine mechanically, straightening up the living room, washing the few dishes from last night, and checking their dwindling food supply. The familiar knot in his stomach tightened as he counted the remaining slices of Mrs. Jenkins's bread. His grandmother stirred restlessly on the couch, her face pinched with discomfort even in sleep. Daniel paused his cleaning to watch her, noting how the early light made her seem more fragile than ever. When he finally pulled on his worn sneakers, their holes carefully patched with tape, his stomach growled loudly. He ignored it, having grown used to the constant hunger that seemed to follow him like a shadow. The community center wasn't far, and hope pushed him forward despite knowing chances were slim. The streets were beginning to wake up as he walked. Mr. Thompson was already outside the center, sweeping the entrance with slow, steady strokes. "Morning, Daniel," the older man called out, his voice gravelly but kind. "How's your granny doing?" "About the same, sir," Daniel replied, shuffling his feet. "Any jobs today?" Mr. Thompson's weathered face fell slightly. "Sorry, son. Nothing new since yesterday." The disappointment felt heavy in Daniel's chest, but he nodded politely. As he stood there, a group of boys his age passed by on the other side of the street, their backpacks bouncing as they laughed and pushed each other playfully. Daniel watched them, feeling the familiar ache of missing school and normal life. A newspaper tumbled across the sidewalk, caught in the morning breeze. Daniel snatched it up, immediately turning to the classified section. His eyes skimmed the job listings while a headline about rising neighborhood crime caught his attention. He folded the paper carefully and tucked it under his arm, saving it to read properly later. When he returned home, his heart jumped into his throat. His grandmother was trying to stand up from the couch, her legs trembling with the effort. "Grandma, no." Daniel rushed forward, catching her just as her knees buckled. "You need to rest." "I just wanted to make you breakfast," Mary whispered as he helped her back onto the couch. Her hands shook as she gripped his arm. Daniel sat beside her, feeling the weight of their situation pressed down on his shoulders like a physical thing. His grandmother's hand found his, her touch gentle despite her weakness. "You're strong, Daniel," she said softly, squeezing his fingers, "even if life doesn't show it yet." The afternoon sun beat down on Daniel's shoulders as he walked through the neighborhood, his eyes scanning the ground for anything valuable. Empty cans and bottles clinked in the plastic bag he carried, each one representing a tiny step toward helping his grandmother. But his mind wandered to bigger dreams, of classrooms filled with other kids, of teachers explaining complex ideas, of a world where learning wasn't just something he scraped together from found treasures. His feet carried him down familiar streets while his thoughts drifted to the science shows he sometimes caught glimpses of through store windows. He imagined understanding how things worked, why his grandmother's medicine did what it did, and how doctors knew how to help people get better. A flash of color caught his eye from beside a dumpster. Daniel's heart leaped when he realized it was a textbook, its cover slightly worn but still intact. "Introduction to Science," he read aloud, running his fingers over the embossed letters. Finding a quiet bench near the local park, Daniel settled down with his newfound treasure. The world around him faded away. The squeaking swings, the shouting kids, the rumble of passing cars, as he immersed himself in chapters about cells and chemical reactions. "That looks like some serious reading," a friendly voice interrupted. Daniel looked up to see a middle-aged man in a neat button-down shirt watching him with curiosity. "Yes, sir," Daniel replied, carefully marking his page. "I'm learning about how things work inside our bodies." "I'm Mr. Ellis," the man introduced himself, sitting down on the other end of the bench. "Do you go to school around here?" Daniel's cheeks flushed slightly. "No, sir. I learn from books I find. I want to be educated, maybe be a doctor someday." Mr. Ellis's expression softened. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a fresh notepad. "Here," he said, holding it out. "For taking notes. Knowledge sticks better when you write it down." Daniel accepted the gift with trembling hands, thanking Mr. Ellis profusely. As evening approached, Daniel hurried toward home, making a quick stop at Wilson's drugstore. Through the window, he checked the prices of the medicine his grandmother needed, his heart sinking at the numbers that seemed to grow larger every month. When he reached home, his grandmother's coughing echoed through their small house, harder and more frequent than before. He found her on the couch, her face flushed with fever. Later that night, after making sure his grandmother was comfortable and finally asleep, Daniel sat cross-legged on the floor. Under the dim light of their only working lamp, he opened Mr. Ellis's notepad and began writing everything he remembered from the science book. His pencil moved quickly across the paper, recording facts about cells and organs, his determination growing with each word. He paused to look at his grandmother's sleeping form, her breathing still ragged but steadier now. The notepad felt like a first step, a tiny piece of the future he desperately wanted to build. Next day, Daniel made his usual rounds through the neighborhood. The familiar sounds of distant traffic and chirping birds accompanied him while he searched for recyclables, his plastic bag already containing a few bottles that clinked together with each step. He'd been doing this every morning for months now, rain or shine, determined to help however he could. Outside Mario's market, Daniel paused to sort through his collection, counting the items carefully. The shop owner's wife, Mrs. Romano, emerged with a small bag of bruised apples and spotted bananas. Her kind eyes crinkled at the corners as she spotted him. "Here, Daniel," she said kindly, passing him the fruit. "They're still good to eat. I added some day-old bread, too." "Thank you, ma'am," Daniel replied, carefully placing the fruit in his backpack. The warmth of her gesture made him stand a little straighter. He moved on to his next regular spot, the Sweet Dreams Bakery, where Mr. Chen always let him sweep the sidewalk for $1. The morning air carried the scent of fresh bread and warm pastries as Daniel worked, methodically pushing the broom across the concrete. His shoulders ached from carrying his growing collection, but he didn't slow down. "Daniel, Daniel!" The urgent cry cut through the quiet morning. Daniel looked up to see Mrs. Jenkins running across the street, her usually neat gray hair disheveled and her face tight with worry. Her house slippers made soft slapping sounds against the pavement. "It's your grandmother," she called out, breathing heavily as she reached him. "She's worse, much worse. I went to check on her and—" Daniel didn't wait to hear more. The broom clattered to the ground as he broke into a run, his heart hammering against his ribs. The 3 blocks home seemed endless as his feet pounded against the pavement, his mind racing with frightening possibilities. Each step felt like it was taking him nowhere fast enough. He burst through the front door to find his grandmother on the couch, her face ashen and beaded with sweat. She tried to speak, but only managed to weakly lift her hand toward the side table. Daniel's eyes followed the gesture to the empty medicine bottle lying there, its label worn from constant handling. Without hesitation, he grabbed his worn jacket from the hook by the door, the fabric threadbare at the elbows. His fingers found the wadded bills in his pocket, money he'd been saving for almost 2 weeks, $7.35. He knew the prices at Wilson's drugstore by heart, had memorized them during his window shopping sessions. The cheapest option was $8, but he had to try. Maybe Mr. Wilson would understand just this once. Daniel raced down the street toward the store, his breath coming in sharp gasps. The neon "Open" sign glowed in the window as he approached, his hand already reaching for the door handle. Sweat trickled down his back despite the cool morning air. As he entered the store, the bell above the door chimed softly, announcing his desperate arrival. His eyes immediately began scanning the familiar shelves, searching for the medicine that could help his grandmother. His heart pounded so loud he could hear it in his ears, drowning out the gentle hum of the store's fluorescent lights. The neat rows of bottles and boxes seemed to blur together as panic threatened to overwhelm him. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Daniel made his way down the narrow aisle. His worn sneakers squeaked against the grimy linoleum floor, and the medicine bottles clinked softly as his trembling hands searched for the right one. Mr. Patel, the kind-eyed store owner who had recently taken over from Mr. Wilson after 20 years of service, gave him a familiar nod from behind the scratched counter. Daniel's fingers closed around the small bottle he needed, and his heart sank as he confirmed the price. $8. He counted his crumpled bills again for the 3rd time, the edges soft from being folded and unfolded repeatedly, knowing he was still short but hoping Mr. Patel might understand like he had last month. The store's brass bell chimed again, its familiar ring now somehow ominous, and Daniel looked up to see a man in dark clothing step inside. Something about the way he moved, predatory and purposeful, made Daniel's stomach tighten into knots. The man wore a black ski mask pulled down over his face despite the mild spring weather outside. Their eyes met for a brief moment through the mask's holes, and Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. Mr. Patel straightened behind the counter, his usual friendly expression replaced with concern, his weathered hands gripping the edge of the counter. The masked man pretended to browse the chips aisle, shuffling between the colorful bags, but his attention seemed focused elsewhere. Daniel watched as the man's eyes darted between the security cameras mounted in the corners of the store, calculating and cold. Frozen in place, Daniel clutched the medicine bottle to his chest like a shield. He wanted to move toward the counter, but his feet wouldn't cooperate, as if rooted to the scuffed floor. The masked man, who would later be identified as Victor, slowly made his way toward the front of the store, his boots making soft thuds against the linoleum. As he passed under one of the flickering lights, Daniel caught the metallic glint of something tucked beneath his worn leather jacket. The tension in the store grew thick as Victor approached the shopping aisles, each step echoing in the silence. Time seemed to slow down as he reached into his jacket, the fabric rustling ominously. Daniel's grip tightened on the medicine bottle, his knuckles turning white against the orange plastic. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the cluttered aisles as Victor took a step back, his neck craning upward to study the ceiling tiles. Daniel remained frozen against the shelf, the medicine bottle still clutched tightly to his chest. His legs felt weak, like they might give out at any moment. The sound of Victor's boots scuffing against the linoleum seemed to echo through the tense silence as he moved toward the center of the store. With surprising agility, Victor reached up and pushed at one of the ceiling panels, testing its weight. Dust sprinkled down like gray snow, catching the harsh store lighting. As Victor prepared to pull himself up, his head snapped toward Daniel's corner. Their eyes met again, and this time Daniel couldn't hide the terror that made his whole body tremble. A cruel smile spread across Victor's face beneath the mask. He lowered his arms and walked toward Daniel with slow, deliberate steps. Daniel pressed himself further against the shelf, wishing he could disappear into it. The metal edges dug painfully into his back, but he barely noticed. Victor crouched down to Daniel's level, the gun hanging loosely at his side, a casual but clear threat. His eyes, visible through the mask's holes, were dark and calculating. The smell of leather and sweat filled Daniel's nostrils as Victor leaned in closer. "Smart kid," Victor whispered, his voice rough and low. He reached into his jacket pocket with his free hand and pulled out a wadded bundle of cash. The bills were wrinkled and messy, some torn at the edges. "Here's the deal," he continued, shoving the money into Daniel's trembling hands. "When the cops come, and they will come, you didn't see anything. You don't know anything. Got it?" Daniel's fingers closed automatically around the warm bills, his mind racing with possibilities. Medicine for his grandmother, food for the week, maybe even some new clothes. But fear kept him rooted to the spot, unable to speak or move. Victor's eyes narrowed behind the mask. "If I hear you said anything..." He left the threat hanging in the air, letting the gun in his hand finish the sentence for him. Rising to his full height, Victor turned and strode back to the center of the store. In the distance, the first faint wails of police sirens cut through the silence. Victor grabbed the edge of the ceiling panel and pulled himself up with practiced ease. Daniel stared down at the crumpled money in his hands, his heart pounding with equal measures of terror and temptation. The wailing of police sirens grew louder, piercing through the thick silence of the store. Daniel's hands trembled as he stared at the crumpled bills, each one representing a possibility he'd only dreamed of before. The money felt hot in his palms, like it might burn right through his skin. His mind raced with calculations. How many bottles of medicine this could buy, how many weeks of food it could put on their empty shelves at home. The weight of his grandmother's illness pressed down on Daniel's shoulders. He could picture her clearly, lying on their worn couch, struggling to breathe, pointing at the empty medicine bottle. The memory of her pale face and weakening voice clashed against Victor's threatening words, creating a storm of confusion in his mind. Daniel took a hesitant step toward Mr. Patel, the money clutched tightly in his fist. His feet felt heavy, each movement a battle between what he knew was right and what his desperate circumstances demanded. Halfway across the store, the sharp sound of a car door slamming made him jump. He froze in place, his heart hammering against his ribs. The store's bell jingled as the door swung open. Daniel instinctively stepped back into the shadows of the medicine aisle, pressing himself against the shelves. A police officer entered, his uniform crisp and his movements measured as he surveyed the store. The fluorescent lights gleamed off his badge as he walked toward the counter, his footsteps echoing in the quiet space. Daniel stood motionless in the shadows, his eyes fixed on the ceiling tiles above. The money in his hands felt heavier with each passing second as the officer's presence filled the small store, making the space feel impossibly cramped. The cop then made his way to the counter where Mr. Patel stood fidgeting with a display of candy bars. "Evening, Mr. Patel," Officer Jackson said, his deep voice carrying across the quiet store. "Noticed some suspicious activity reported in the area. Seen anything unusual?" Mr. Patel's hands trembled slightly as he arranged and rearranged the same row of chocolate bars. No, nothing unusual, officer," he stammered. his eyes darting briefly toward the ceiling before focusing back on the counter. In the shadows of the medicine aisle, Daniel felt his pulse racing. The crumpled bills in his hand seemed to burn against his palm, each wrinkle a reminder of Victor's threat. His mind spun with the weight of his choices, his grandmother's needs warring against the fear coursing through his veins. Officer Jackson's gaze drifted around the store, his expression sharpening as he noticed Daniel standing motionless in the corner. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the officer's face as he took a step toward the boy. "Everything okay over there, son?" Officer Jackson asked, his tone gentle but firm. His eyes noted Daniel's tense posture and the way the boy seemed to be trying to make himself smaller against the shelves. Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but the words stuck in his throat. I'm just here for medicine," he managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. "For my grandmother. She's sick." Officer Jackson's eyes narrowed slightly, picking up on the tremor in Daniel's voice. He turned back to Mr. Patel, who was now gripping the edge of the counter. "Mind if I take a look at your security footage?" Daniel's eyes shot up to the ceiling, his heart thundering so loud he was sure everyone could hear it. Officer Jackson noticed the boy's reaction and took another step toward the back room where the security equipment was kept. Just as the officer was about to turn away, Daniel felt something shift inside him. The weight of the stolen money in his hand, the memory of his grandmother's labored breathing, and the crushing pressure of Victor's threat all seemed to collide at once. Taking a shaky breath, he whispered, "He's there." His trembling finger pointed toward the ceiling. Officer Jackson's eyes followed Daniel's gesture upward, and understanding dawned on his weathered face. Officer Jackson's eyes narrowed as he traced Daniel's pointing finger to the ceiling. The fluorescent lights cast an eerie glow on the dusty panels above, and the store fell into a thick, heavy silence. Mr. Patel's face transformed from shock to fear in an instant, his hands gripping the counter's edge so hard his knuckles turned white. Daniel took a small step backward, his sneakers squeaking against the linoleum floor as the weight of what he'd just done settled over him. The officer's posture changed immediately, his shoulders squaring as he assessed the situation. With practiced calm, he took several measured steps backward, his right hand extending toward Daniel in a clear signal to stay behind him. The movement was slow and deliberate, like a dancer performing a carefully choreographed routine. "Dispatch, this is Officer Jackson." He spoke into his radio, his voice steady but carrying an unmistakable urgency. "Possible armed suspect hiding in the ceiling at Pat's Convenience on 5th Street. Requesting immediate backup." A soft scratching sound echoed from above, followed by a muffled thump. Daniel's heart leaped into his throat. Victor was moving up there. Officer Jackson's hand moved to rest on his holstered weapon, his eyes never leaving the ceiling. "Mr. Patel, don't move," Officer Jackson commanded in a low, firm voice. Then, turning slightly toward Daniel, he gestured toward the counter. "Son, I need you to get behind there and stay low. Can you do that for me?" Daniel nodded quickly, his legs feeling like jelly as he scrambled behind the counter. He crouched down next to Mr. Patel, who had sunk to his knees, muttering what sounded like a prayer under his breath. From his position, Daniel could just see Officer Jackson through the gap between the counter and the cigarette display above. The officer positioned himself near the entrance, his stance wide and stable, one hand resting on his weapon while the other remained ready at his side. The wail of approaching sirens grew louder, their sound bleeding through the store's thin walls. More dust sprinkled down from the ceiling as Victor shifted again, causing one of the panels to creak ominously. Daniel held his breath, watching as small particles danced in the beam of the security light. Officer Jackson turned his head slightly, catching Daniel's eye through the gap in the counter. He gave the boy a firm, reassuring nod, a silent acknowledgement of Daniel's courage. Then, taking a deep breath, the officer squared his shoulders and prepared himself for whatever would happen next. Shortly after, 3 police officers rushed in, their boots squeaking against the linoleum floor. Daniel watched from behind the counter as they moved with practiced precision, their radios crackling softly at their hips. Officer Jackson greeted them with quick, hushed words, his hand gestures indicating the situation above. "Suspects in the ceiling," Officer Jackson whispered. pointing to where they'd last heard movement. Armed and dangerous. Daniel's fingers brushed against the wadded cash in his pocket, the paper feeling rough and dirty against his skin. His heart thumped so loud he was sure everyone could hear it. Mr. Patel remained frozen beside him, his breathing shallow and quick. The backup officers spread out across the small store, taking positions near the aisles and behind shelving units. One officer, a younger man with close-cropped hair, retrieved a metal stepladder from the storage room. The ladder's feet scraped against the floor as he positioned it carefully beneath the spot where they'd heard Victor moving. Officer Jackson moved swiftly to where Daniel crouched. "Stay down," he instructed, gently pushing Daniel further behind the counter. "Don't move until I tell you it's safe." His voice was firm but kind, his eyes reflecting both authority and concern. The young officer climbed the ladder slowly, each step causing a slight metallic creak. When he reached the top, he balanced carefully, reaching up toward the ceiling panel. Small pieces of white dust sprinkled down as he pressed against it. The panel lifted slightly, revealing darkness beyond. More dust and pink insulation material floated down like dirty snow. The store fell completely silent, every person holding their breath. Suddenly, there was a violent movement above. The ladder wobbled dangerously, and the officer grabbed it with both hands to steady himself. Victor's voice boomed through the opening, raw with desperation. "Back off," he shouted. "I've got a gun and I'll use it. Nobody move." The backup officers tightened their grips on their weapons, exchanging quick glances. Officer Jackson stepped forward, his voice calm and steady. "Let's talk about this," he called up to Victor. "Nobody needs to get hurt today. We can work something out." Daniel pressed himself against the counter's base, his chest so tight he could barely draw breath. The air felt thick with tension as Officer Jackson continued trying to reason with the cornered man above them. Officer Jackson kept his voice steady and reassuring as he spoke to Victor. "We can end this peacefully. Just come down, and we'll talk this through." His hands remained visible, showing he meant no harm. "Stay back." Victor's voice cracked with panic. "I mean it." The fear in his tone was unmistakable, a sharp contrast to his earlier threatening demeanor. Through a small gap in the counter's wooden panels, Daniel watched the scene unfold. His heart raced as he observed Victor's face through the ceiling opening, pale, sweaty, and filled with desperation. Mr. Patel remained perfectly still beside him, barely breathing. The backup officers moved with careful precision, their footsteps silent on the linoleum floor. One officer, following Officer Jackson's subtle hand signal, edged closer to the store's entrance. The movement was so smooth it barely disturbed the tense air in the store. Victor's eyes darted frantically between the officers below, like a trapped animal searching for escape. Every slight movement he made caused the ceiling to protest with ominous creaks. Small pieces of ceiling tile continued to rain down, dusting the floor below. "Everyone stay absolutely still," Officer Jackson commanded in a low, firm voice. His eyes locked briefly with Daniel's, conveying a silent message of reassurance. "Mr. Patel, Daniel, don't move a muscle." The sudden slam of a car door outside pierced the tension. Victor's head snapped toward the sound, his attention diverted for just a split second. The officer on the ladder acted instantly, shoving the ceiling panel up with decisive force. Victor barely had time to react before the officers moved as one, their coordinated actions swift and precise. They grabbed him, pulling him down from his hiding spot as he thrashed and struggled against their grip. Within moments, they had him on the ground, securing his hands behind his back with handcuffs. Victor's resistance was brief and futile against their trained movements. The officers lifted him to his feet and began leading him toward the door. Daniel released a shaky breath, his fingers still wrapped tightly around the crumpled money in his pocket. The nightmare was over. The store settled into an unsettling quiet after Victor was escorted out. Only the hum of the fluorescent lights and the soft murmur of officers taking notes broke the silence. Mr. Patel leaned against his counter, his shoulders finally relaxing as he answered questions from one of the backup officers. Daniel remained crouched behind the counter, his fingers still wrapped tightly around the wadded bills in his pocket. Officer Jackson finished conferring with his colleagues before making his way over to Daniel. He knelt down, bringing himself to eye level with the boy. His kind eyes crinkled at the corners as he spoke. "What you did today was incredibly brave, son. Without your help, this could have gone very differently." His voice was gentle but firm. "You helped us catch someone dangerous." Daniel nodded, his throat tight. The weight of the money felt like lead in his pocket. His hands trembled as he slowly pulled out the crumpled bills. He gave me this." Daniel's voice cracked as he held out the money to Officer Jackson. "Said I needed to stay quiet or else." Tears welled up in his eyes, but he blinked them back. "I know we need it, but I couldn't keep it." Officer Jackson's expression softened as he accepted the money, his eyes showing both surprise and understanding. Behind them, Mr. Patel had stopped mid-sentence in his statement, watching the exchange with widening eyes. "Yep, that must have been a very hard choice," Officer Jackson said softly, noting how Daniel's gaze lingered on the bills. "But you did the right thing. The absolutely right thing." Mr. Patel stepped closer, his face etched with concern as he looked at Daniel. The boy who regularly visited his store now appeared in a different light. Not just a customer, but a young man of remarkable character. He told the officer how Daniel worked hard to make ends meet, and how tough his life had been so far. "We're going to find a way to help you," Officer Jackson promised, his voice carrying the weight of certainty. "You don't have to carry everything alone." Rising to his feet, Officer Jackson placed a steady hand on Daniel's shoulder. "Go home and get some rest. You've been through a lot today." He turned to share a meaningful look with Mr. Patel before heading toward the door, the unspoken understanding between the two men clear in their expressions. Daniel stepped out of the store into the fading daylight, his legs feeling heavy beneath him. The medicine bottle in his hand was a small comfort as he trudged along the cracked sidewalk. Every few steps he glanced down at it, reassuring himself that at least he had managed to get what his grandmother desperately needed. Back at the store, Officer Jackson watched Daniel's retreating figure before heading to his patrol car. He settled into the driver's seat and pulled out his phone, scrolling until he found the number he needed. After a moment's hesitation, he dialed Grace Mitchell, a social worker known for her dedication to helping families in crisis. "Grace, it's Jackson Martinez. I need your help with something urgent." His voice carried the weight of the day's events as he detailed what had happened in the store. This kid, he showed incredible character today, handed over money that could have helped his family just because it was the right thing to do. I wanted to see if we could help him somehow. Grace listened intently on the other end. "I can come by first thing tomorrow morning," she said without hesitation. "We'll figure out how to help them." Meanwhile, Daniel pushed open the door to his home, finding his grandmother exactly where he'd left her. Her face brightened at his return, though concern creased her brow when she noticed his pale complexion. "Here's your medicine, Grandma," he said quietly, helping her with the bottle. Mary took the pills gratefully, then pulled Daniel into a tight hug. She could feel the slight tremor in his body, sensing something was wrong, but not wanting to press him just yet. "Thank you, sweetheart," she whispered, holding him close. As evening settled in, Daniel sat beside his grandmother's bed, watching as the medicine slowly took effect and her breathing became more regular. His mind kept replaying the events at the store. The masked man, the money, Officer Jackson's kind eyes. Though exhaustion tugged at him, he couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. When his grandmother finally drifted off to sleep, Daniel lay down beside her, drawing comfort from her familiar presence. The warmth of her body and the steady sound of her breathing helped calm his racing thoughts. His eyes grew heavy as the day's tension began to fade, and he slowly gave in to his exhaustion. In his patrol car, Officer Jackson finished his conversation with Grace. "Tomorrow at 9 then?" he confirmed, jotting down notes. "Thanks, Grace. These folks really need our help." The morning sun crept through the cracked window, painting golden streaks across the worn floorboards of Daniel's house. Mary stirred on her bed, her breathing noticeably steadier than the day before. The medicine had helped, bringing some color back to her cheeks. Daniel sat in his usual spot nearby, his small hands rubbing at tired eyes as memories of yesterday's events played through his mind. A firm knock at the door made both of them jump. Daniel exchanged a quick glance with his grandmother before padding across the floor. When he opened the door, Officer Jackson's tall frame filled the doorway, his kind face breaking into a warm smile. In his arms, he carried a brown paper bag filled with groceries. "Good morning," Officer Jackson said, his voice gentle. "I hope I'm not disturbing you too early." Mary pushed herself up slightly on her pillows, surprise and gratitude mingling on her face as Officer Jackson stepped inside. He placed the groceries on their small table and turned to face them both. "Nothing. I wanted to check in and see how you were doing after yesterday," he explained, his eyes moving between grandmother and son. "And to tell you, ma'am, what an incredible young man you've raised." Officer Jackson pulled up a chair and told Mary about Daniel's bravery during the robbery, how he'd done the right thing despite the temptation and pressure to stay quiet. Mary's eyes welled with tears as she listened, reaching out to squeeze Daniel's hand. "There's something else," Officer Jackson said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small white envelope and handed it to Daniel. "Mr. Patel, the store owner, wanted you to have this. He was very impressed by your honesty." Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he opened the envelope. Inside was a gift card for groceries. He stared at it, his vision blurring with tears as he realized what it meant. Real food, enough for weeks. "Thank you," Mary whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "For everything you've done." Officer Jackson smiled and stood up. "I've also spoken with a social worker named Grace Mitchell. She'd like to meet with you both, see how she can help make things easier." He adjusted his uniform and moved toward the door. "I'll be back in sometime with her, if that's all right." Daniel and Mary nodded, a new feeling settling over them, one that felt remarkably like hope. Later, Daniel moved around their small home, straightening what little they had. He picked up scattered newspapers and arranged the mismatched cushions on their worn couch, while Mary slowly made her way around with a damp cloth, wiping surfaces despite the visible strain on her face. "Granny, please sit down," Daniel said, noticing how she pressed her hand against her side. "I can finish up." Mary shook her head but couldn't hide her wince. "I want everything to look nice when they arrive." Daniel kept glancing out the window every few minutes, his stomach doing little flips each time he heard a car pass by. When he finally spotted Officer Jackson's patrol car pulling up, his heart started racing. The knock came moments later, 3 gentle taps. Daniel opened the door to find Officer Jackson standing there with Grace Mitchell, a woman with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when she smiled. "Hello, Daniel," Grace said warmly, stepping inside. "And you must be Mary. I'm Grace Mitchell." The social worker moved with quiet confidence, settling into their space as if she'd known them for years. She sat down across from Mary, her voice soft and gentle as she introduced herself properly. "Officer Jackson has told me quite a bit about you both," Grace said, pulling out a small notebook. "I'd like to understand your situation better so we can figure out the best way to help." Over the next hour, Grace asked questions about their daily life, how they managed for food, what kind of medical care Mary received, their income situation. Daniel watched as his grandmother explained their circumstances, noting how Grace listened without judgment, her pen moving steadily across her notepad. "And Daniel," Grace turned to him, "Officer Jackson tells me you're quite the scholar." Daniel ducked his head shyly at first, but gradually opened up about the books he'd found, his dreams of becoming a doctor, and the odd jobs he did around the neighborhood. Officer Jackson chimed in, recounting Daniel's actions during the robbery, emphasizing the boy's integrity despite their desperate circumstances. "Not many people would have done what Daniel did," Officer Jackson said firmly. "That kind of character deserves our support." Grace nodded, closing her notebook. She stood up and smoothed her skirt, looking at both Daniel and Mary with determination. "I think I know how we can help," she said. "I'm going to organize a local charity fundraiser, and we'll set up an online donation page too. We can raise money for your immediate needs and start building a fund for Daniel's education." Daniel's eyes grew wide at her words, and he saw his grandmother's hands trembling slightly as she pressed them together. The small room, which had always felt heavy with worry, suddenly seemed lighter, filled with possibility. Daniel sat at the worn kitchen table, his fingers tracing the edges of the paper Grace had left behind. The fundraiser details were written in neat, clear handwriting. Date, time, and location all carefully noted. Through the thin walls, he could hear his grandmother's steady breathing as she rested, the sound somehow lighter than it had been in weeks. The afternoon sun cast warm patches on the faded linoleum floor when Officer Jackson's knock echoed through the house. He entered carrying a brown paper bag filled with essentials: bread, milk, and some basic medical supplies. "How's everyone doing?" Officer Jackson asked, setting the bag on the counter. His uniform was slightly wrinkled from his shift, but his smile remained warm and genuine. "Better," Daniel replied, helping to unpack the supplies. "Grandma's resting now." Officer Jackson pulled out a chair and sat across from Daniel. "Tell me more about what interests you in science. What makes you want to become a doctor?" Daniel's eyes lit up as he spoke about the textbook he'd found, explaining complex concepts with surprising clarity for his age. "If I become a doctor, I could help people like my granny," he said softly. "Maybe even find new ways to treat sick people who can't afford medicine." The phone in Officer Jackson's pocket buzzed. It was Grace, her voice excited even through the speaker as she shared news about the online fundraiser already gaining traction. A gentle knock at the door revealed Mrs. Jenkins, her weathered face beaming. "I heard about the charity event," she said, pressing a small envelope into Daniel's hands. "It's not much, but I've been telling everyone I know." From her bedroom, Mary called out, "Daniel, is that Mrs. Jenkins I hear?" "Yes, Granny," Daniel answered, moving to check on her. She was sitting up in bed, color returning to her cheeks. "You're such a good boy," Mary said, reaching for his hand. "I'm so proud of you, sweetheart. So proud of everything you've done." Daniel squeezed her hand, feeling tears prick at his corners of his eyes. He quickly wiped them away as Officer Jackson appeared in the doorway. The late afternoon sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink as Officer Jackson prepared to leave. Daniel stood by the window, watching the colors change, feeling a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the weather. "I'll be back tomorrow to check on you both," Officer Jackson said, giving Daniel's shoulder a gentle pat. "Things are looking up, son." The day of the fundraiser event finally arrived, waking up Daniel quite early in the morning. Turning his head, he caught sight of his grandmother sleeping peacefully on her bed across the room. Her breathing was steady, face relaxed. A rare moment of tranquility that brought a smile to his face. Daniel moved quietly through their modest home, straightening the few possessions they owned. He smoothed the wrinkles from the worn couch cushions and arranged the medicine bottles neatly on the kitchen counter. Mary woke to find him dusting their single bookshelf, her heart swelling with pride at his careful attention to detail. "Good morning, sweetheart," she called softly. Before Daniel could respond, a gentle knock echoed through the house. He opened the door to find Officer Jackson's familiar face alongside Grace Mitchell. She carried a professional-looking folder and held a tablet close to her chest, her warm smile immediately putting them at ease. "We've got some wonderful news to share," Grace said as she settled onto their couch. She opened her folder and turned her tablet screen toward them. "The fundraiser is gaining more support than we expected. Several local businesses have already pledged donations." Daniel leaned forward, eyes wide with interest as Grace continued explaining. "We're planning a charity event for next weekend. There's real momentum building in the community." Mary reached for Daniel's hand as Grace revealed their plans for the funds. "A portion will be dedicated specifically to Daniel's education," she explained. "School supplies, books, and we're looking into finding a tutor who can help you catch up on your studies." Daniel's face lit up at the mention of education, his grip tightening on his grandmother's hand. Mary dabbed at her eyes with her free hand, overwhelmed by the kindness being shown to them. "We can't thank you enough," Mary whispered, her voice thick with emotion. As if on cue, there was another knock at the door. Mrs. Jenkins stood there with a small envelope in her hands, and behind her, several other neighbors waited with their own modest contributions. "We all want to help," Mrs. Jenkins said simply, pressing the envelope into Daniel's hands. Grace spread the folder's contents across the coffee table: brochures for local schools, information about tutoring programs, and educational resources. Daniel's eyes moved from paper to paper, drinking in every detail while his grandmother held his hand, both of them feeling the warm surge of hope rising in their chests. The community center buzzed with activity as volunteers scurried around, setting up folding tables and hanging colorful banners. Donation jars lined the tables, each decorated with hopeful messages, while the smell of fresh coffee and baked goods filled the air. Daniel stepped through the doors with Mary beside him, her steps slow but steady. Officer Jackson's hand rested supportively on Daniel's shoulder. "There's already quite a crowd gathering," Officer Jackson said warmly, "and they're all here for you." The familiar faces of their neighbors began filtering in, Mrs. Jenkins with her gentle smile, Mr. Thompson nodding encouragingly as he passed. New faces appeared too, people who had heard about Daniel's story through friends or local news. The room hummed with conversation and purpose. Grace stood at the front, her voice clear and passionate as she welcomed everyone. "Today we're here to support an extraordinary young man and his grandmother," she began, gesturing toward Daniel and Mary. "Their story is one of resilience, honesty, and unwavering love." As Grace recounted the events at Mr. Patel's store and Daniel's choice to do the right thing, many eyes in the room grew misty. People began approaching the donation jars, dropping in bills and checks. Daniel watched in amazement as strangers listened intently to his story, their faces showing genuine care and concern. Though initially hesitant, Daniel found himself drawn into conversations with various guests. Each person who spoke to him offered words of encouragement, and some brought small gifts, books, school supplies, and notes of support. Mary sat nearby in a cushioned chair, wiping away tears as she watched her son navigate the crowd with growing confidence. The door opened again, and a distinguished-looking man in an expensive suit entered quietly, observing the scene before him. Grace quickly made her way over. "Mr. Bennett," she greeted him warmly, leading him through the crowd. "Thank you for coming." The local philanthropist made his way to Daniel, who stood a little straighter under his kind but evaluating gaze. "So you're the young man I've heard so much about," Mr. Bennett said, his voice gentle but carrying authority. "Grace tells me you have a particular interest in science?" Daniel nodded, his voice steady despite his nervousness. "Yes, sir. I want to be a doctor someday." Mr. Bennett smiled, clearly impressed by Daniel's direct answer and clear goals. He spent several minutes asking Daniel about his favorite subjects and what he'd learned from his self-study sessions with found textbooks. Finally, Mr. Bennett made his way to the front of the room and called for everyone's attention. The crowd fell silent as he cleared his throat and announced, "After meeting this remarkable young man and hearing his story, I've made a decision. I will personally ensure that Daniel's education is fully funded through high school and beyond." The room erupted in applause and cheers. Daniel stood frozen in disbelief, his grandmother's hand finding his and squeezing tightly as tears streamed down both their faces. After the event, it was for the first time in years that Daniel woke up without the heavy weight of worry pressing down on his chest. Mr. Bennett's words from yesterday echoed in his mind, making him smile. His education would be fully funded. In the kitchen, Mary hummed softly as she made tea, her movements lighter despite her illness. The whole house seemed brighter somehow, as if hope itself had painted the walls with fresh colors. When Grace arrived later that morning, she carried a folder thick with papers. "These are all the documents for your scholarship program, Daniel," she explained, spreading them across the kitchen table. Mary sat close by, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue as Grace went through each form. "Mr. Bennett has arranged to meet with you both next week," Grace said, her eyes twinkling. "He wants to discuss everything in detail and make sure you have everything you need." Officer Jackson arrived just then, bringing fresh coffee for everyone. He watched with pride as Daniel carefully read through each document, asking thoughtful questions. The afternoon brought a stream of visitors. Mrs. Jenkins appeared with a homemade chocolate cake, its frosting slightly lopsided but made with obvious care. "You deserve this celebration, Daniel," she said, setting it on the counter. Mr. Thompson followed shortly after, carrying a cardboard box that he placed carefully in front of Daniel. "Found these in my attic," he said gruffly, though his eyes were kind. "Thought you might like them." Inside, Daniel discovered a set of well-worn science textbooks, their pages filled with knowledge waiting to be explored. Grace made a few phone calls and arranged for Daniel to meet with a tutor the following week. "She'll help you prepare for regular classes," Grace explained. "It's a big transition, but you won't be doing it alone." As the visitors began to leave, Officer Jackson pulled Daniel aside. The tall policeman knelt down to meet Daniel's eyes. "What happened at the store that day? Your honesty, your courage, that's what made all this possible," he said softly. "You did the right thing even when it was hard, and that shows real character." Daniel clutched his new books to his chest, feeling the smooth covers under his fingers. Looking up at Officer Jackson, he said quietly, "Thank you for believing in me." The officer's eyes glistened as he replied, "The world needs more people like you, Daniel." Daniel sat at his desk, running his fingers over the smooth pages of his new textbooks. The morning sunlight streamed through the window, warming his workspace and highlighting the neat stack of study materials provided by Mr. Bennett's scholarship. His small room felt different now, more purposeful, more alive with possibility. The science books Mr. Thompson had given him lined a makeshift shelf, their worn spines a reminder of where his journey had begun. The fresh scent of new paper mingled with the familiar comfort of his room, creating an atmosphere of focused determination. From her bed in the corner, Mary watched her grandson with quiet pride. Her breathing was steadier these days, thanks to proper medical care, and color had returned to her cheeks. The morning light caught the silver threads in her hair as she adjusted herself against the pillows. "How are the new books?" she asked softly. "They're amazing, Grandma," Daniel replied, his eyes bright with enthusiasm. "There's so much to learn." He carefully turned another page, treating each book like a precious treasure. The transition into formal education proved both challenging and exhilarating. During his first day at school, Daniel walked through the halls with a mix of nervousness and determination. His teachers, briefed about his background, welcomed him warmly. The familiar scent of chalk dust and floor cleaner filled the air as he found his way from class to class. Mrs. Rodriguez, his science teacher, took special interest in his enthusiasm for the subject. "You have a natural curiosity," she told him after class, reviewing his first assignment. "That's the mark of a true scientist." She pointed out specific areas where his insights showed particular promise. As weeks passed, Daniel found himself surrounded by other students who shared his passion for learning. During lunch breaks, he joined study groups where they discussed complex problems and shared insights. The cafeteria buzzed with energy as they huddled over their books, trading ideas and explanations. Tommy, a boy from his chemistry class, became a regular study partner. "You explain things better than the textbook sometimes," Tommy admitted one day as they worked on their homework together. He scratched his head and grinned. "You make it all make sense." Officer Jackson maintained his presence in Daniel's life, stopping by regularly to check on his progress. One afternoon, he found Daniel surrounded by books and notes, deep in concentration. The afternoon light cast long shadows across the floor as the officer stood in the doorway. "Looking good, kid," Officer Jackson said, leaning against the doorframe. His uniform caught the light as he shifted his weight. "How's school treating you?" Daniel looked up with a tired but satisfied smile. "It's challenging, but I love it. Every day I learn something new about how the human body works, about medicine." His voice carried the warmth of genuine passion. Grace visited too, primarily to check on Mary's health, but always taking time to praise Daniel's academic achievements. Her clipboard tucked under her arm, she would sit and listen as grandmother and son shared their progress. The community's donations had ensured Mary received proper medical attention, and the improvement in her condition was evident. "The doctors say I'm responding well to the new treatment," Mary told Grace during one of her visits, her voice stronger than it had been in months. She sat straighter in bed now, her hands steady as she held her cup of tea. Late into the evenings, Daniel would study under his desk lamp, occasionally glancing at the old medicine bottle he kept as a reminder of his promise to become a doctor. The soft yellow light created a cozy circle around his workspace, while moths tapped gently against his window. The path ahead was long, but his determination never wavered. His first major school project became a labor of love, a detailed model of the solar system. He spent hours ensuring each planet was properly scaled and positioned, adding small details about their compositions and atmospheres. His fingers were stained with paint, and tiny specks of glitter dusted his workspace. When he presented it to his class, even students who usually paid little attention sat up straighter, engaged by his passionate explanation of planetary motion and gravitational forces. Mrs. Rodriguez awarded him the highest grade in the class. "This is university-level work, Daniel," she said, examining the detailed notes accompanying his model. Her red pen remained unused as she reviewed his careful calculations. Walking home that evening, Daniel carried his solar system model carefully in his arms. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, and the first stars were beginning to appear. A gentle breeze ruffled his hair as he paused to look upward. Looking up at them, he whispered, "This is just the beginning." His words carried the weight of promise and possibility. Daniel stared out his bedroom window, memories washing over him like waves. He remembered the countless nights spent worrying about medicine, about food, about his grandmother's worsening condition. Those dark moments when he'd curl up on his thin mattress, wondering if they'd ever find a way out of their struggles. Now, sitting at his new desk with textbooks spread before him, everything felt different. The morning light streamed through the recently repaired window, casting a warm glow over his homework. He could hear his grandmother's gentle humming from the kitchen, a sound that had become more frequent lately. The transition to formal schooling hadn't been easy. Daniel found himself facing challenges he'd never encountered before. Math, in particular, proved to be his biggest hurdle. Last week's algebra test left him feeling particularly discouraged. The numbers had seemed to swim before his eyes, and despite his hours of preparation, he'd struggled to complete all the problems. His new friends, though, refused to let him give up. They formed a study group during lunch breaks, working through practice problems together. Sarah, who excelled at math, showed particular patience in explaining concepts he found difficult. One evening, as Daniel wrestled with equations, Mary sat beside him and shared stories from her own school days. "I remember feeling just as overwhelmed," she told him, her voice soft with memory. "But each challenge we face makes us stronger." Years had transformed the modest house where Daniel and Mary lived. Though still small, it now held warmth and hope within its walls. Daniel's hands trembled as he held the thick envelope from the medical school. Mary sat beside him on their worn but clean couch, her eyes bright with anticipation. "Dear Mr. Carter," he read aloud, his voice catching, "we are pleased to inform you of your acceptance." The rest of the words blurred as tears filled his eyes. Mary pulled him close, her own tears falling freely. "My boy," she whispered, her voice filled with pride. "You did it." Later that afternoon, Officer Jackson arrived with Grace, both wearing broad smiles. They gathered in the living room, where memories of that fateful day in the store came flooding back. "I'll never forget how brave you were," Officer Jackson said, his eyes crinkling with emotion. "Speaking up that day, that took real courage." Grace nodded in agreement. "That one moment of honesty changed everything. Look how far you've come." A letter arrived from Mr. Bennett, expressing his pride in Daniel's achievements. The scholarship package enclosed would cover his medical school expenses completely, allowing him to pursue his dreams without financial burden. Daniel made his way to the community center where familiar faces greeted him with warm hugs. Mr. Thompson's eyes misted over as he recalled the young boy who used to sweep the floors for spare change. Mrs. Jenkins fussed over him, bringing out a homemade cake to celebrate. Mary turned to Grace, her voice thick with emotion. "You saw something in us when others looked away. You gave us hope when we needed it most." The community gathered for a celebration, filling the center with laughter and joy. Stories flowed freely, tales of Daniel's determination, his kindness, his unwavering spirit. Officer Jackson pulled him aside during the festivities. "You know," he said quietly, "standing up for what's right isn't always easy, but you showed us all that day that courage comes in many forms." As the celebration continued around them, Daniel stood outside the community center, taking in the familiar sights. Officer Jackson joined him, placing a supportive hand on his shoulder. Daniel looked at the place that had witnessed his journey from a struggling boy to a future doctor. "Thank you for making this possible," he whispered, his words carried away by the gentle evening breeze. Much like his pre-university education, Daniel finished his college and passed with flying colors, becoming one of the most renowned doctors in town. The hospital corridors buzzed with activity as Dr. Daniel Carter made his rounds. His white coat swished softly with each confident stride, the stethoscope around his neck a symbol of the dreams he'd worked so hard to achieve. Nurses and fellow doctors greeted him warmly as he passed, respecting both his skill and his humble demeanor. A call from the front desk caught his attention. "Dr. Carter, there's someone here to see you." When Daniel reached the waiting area, his face broke into a wide smile. There stood Officer Jackson, his hair now completely gray, but his eyes still carrying that same warmth and strength that had meant so much to Daniel years ago. Though retired now, the former officer's presence still commanded respect. "Officer Jackson!" Daniel exclaimed, stepping forward to embrace the man who had changed his life. "Just Jackson now," the older man chuckled, returning the hug with equal enthusiasm. "Look at you, Dr. Carter. Has a nice ring to it." Daniel insisted on giving his old friend a tour of the hospital, particularly proud to show off the pediatric wing where he worked. They walked slowly, taking their time as Daniel pointed out different departments and shared stories about his patients. "Remember when you couldn't even afford medicine for your grandmother?" Jackson said softly as they paused by a window overlooking the city. "Now look at you, helping so many families." "I wouldn't be here without you," Daniel replied, his voice thick with emotion. "That day in the store, when you believed in me, it changed everything." Jackson shook his head, smiling. "You did all the hard work, son. I just helped point you in the right direction." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, both thinking about that pivotal day in the small store when a scared young boy had found the courage to speak up. As the sun began to set, Daniel walked Jackson to the hospital entrance. The golden light painted everything in warm hues, reminiscent of new beginnings. They paused at the doors, facing each other. "You've made me proud, son," Jackson said, his eyes glistening. Daniel smiled, his own eyes bright with emotion. "And I'll keep making you proud." They shared a final nod before parting ways, Daniel watching as Jackson's figure disappeared into the evening light. The weight of their shared history, the journey from that frightened boy to the doctor he'd become, settled around him like a comfortable embrace. If you enjoyed the story of Daniel, I hand-picked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.